This video was sponsored by Bliss.
Hey, in this video, I'm going to show you how I made this sweet clamp storage wall with secret extra clamp storage. So, follow along, watch the video, check out the video description for all the links to tools and everything that I used in this video. If you're not signed up for Patreon, well, you're missing out. Go sign up for Patreon. There's a ton of behind the scenes content over there, coupon codes, live weekly question and answers, and right now we're running a contest where you could win a chance for me to come out to your place and build a project with you. So sign up for that, but just watch the video for now and then take care of all that other stuff later. Okay.
This is how it started.
I could use some more clamps. Add to cart.
They say that you can never have too many clamps. Well, I consider that a challenge and I set out to prove them wrong. So I got online and I ordered a little bit of everything. Clamps galore.
I might have bought too many clamps. What am I gonna do with all these?
But the best part of buying new stuff is, of course, figuring out a cool organizational way to store it all in your shop. So I had an idea. I've always had this space in my shop that really isn't doing much. It's this blank area of wall right here. Now most of the time I just stack sheet goods here and it's quite a mess. So I cleaned those all out of the way and figured I might as well do something sweet to store all my new clamps. So I thought about it and I thought about it and I got to work. I went and bought myself some 6/4 hard maple. Because you know when you're building storage for your shop, you might as well get a really expensive wood. I'm always under the mindset that if I build it, I want to build it once and forget about it. So I might as well do this thing right. So I grabbed my precious hard maple and started cutting it down to size. Now I'm basically going to build two identical cabinets, one layered on top of the other. The only difference is one is going to be hooked firmly to the wall and the other one is going to be hinged to that one, and it's going to open up to reveal some secret clamp storage to really maximize wall space. So I started milling up that maple to get it nice and square and even and to the right size so that I could start putting a cabinet together. Of course I joined it and ran it through the table saw, and then I planed it all down to just about at 1 inch thick. Now I'm gonna build this cabinet in a kinda weird way. In fact, it's a way I've never really built a cabinet before, but I thought it appropriate for the whole system that I'm trying to create here. The first thing I did was take the pieces for my outer cabinet and I ran them through the dado saw, putting a 3/4 inch groove right down the middle. That looked something like this. That's gonna allow me to float a 3/4 inch piece of plywood right in the middle of my outside frame. Now for the frame that's going to be hooked to the wall, I also did a dadoed groove or rabbet, but I did this one right along the edge of my piece of maple. And that looked something like this. It's also not 3/4 of an inch thick, it's 1.25 inches. And I'll tell you why here in just a second. Now with all my pieces cut to size and that groove milled out, I took a full 4x8 sheet of plywood and I plopped it against my wall. I decided just to go with a 4x8 sheet because that way, because that way I wouldn't have to cut down plywood and it would just be a lot easier on myself. So after getting the piece of 3/4 inch ply and sticking it against the wall, I then pulled out a stud finder and I found all my studs. I want to hook this thing nice and secure to the wall so that it's a good anchor point that I can hinge that outer cabinet off of. So after locating all my studs, I just started sending screws through that plywood, anchoring that thing so that it would not budge. This took a little while, and between you and me, I probably put more screws in there than I needed to, but I really didn't want it to go anywhere. Now, because I'm going to be hanging a lot of clamps off this, I wanted something a little thicker than 3/4 of an inch to screw all my clamp hangers into. So I decided to plop another piece of 1/2 inch ply on top of my 3/4 inch ply to bring the full thickness out to 1 1/4 inches. That would be plenty to get a lot of screws into and know that anywhere I put stuff, whoa, jeez, getting tired of that. Anywhere I put screws would be fine because I'd have 1 1/4 inches to work with. Now here is where I made a stupid, terrible, idiotic mistake that will come back to bite me at some point later down the road in the future. And that was, for some reason, I decided to glue this piece of 1/2 inch to that piece of 3/4 inch. Now the reason this was stupid is because I already screwed that piece of 3/4 inch to the wall, and now I'm gluing a piece of 1/2 inch hiding all of those screws, and I'll screw that piece of 1/2 inch into the piece of 3/4 inch, which means that if I ever want to remove this piece of plywood from the wall, it is going to be darn near impossible because I can no longer get to the screws on that 3/4 inch. What a doofus. But anyways, we'll move on and forget I did that. Next, I took my pieces with that 1 1/4 inch groove that I carved out on the dado saw. I removed Frank from the wall. He's been a good companion for quite a few years. And I marked out all my side pieces to pre-drill for screws. Now, I'm basically gonna build my cabinet box around the plywood that's already up on the wall. I figured this would be easier than trying to build a separate piece and just attaching it to the wall. Well, maybe not easier, but I thought it would be a lot stronger. And I really want that cabinet against the wall to be beefy as all get out so that when I hinge that outer cabinet to it, I know it'll be a solid anchor point. So after marking out where I wanted all my screws to land, I went over to the drill press and using a 3/8 inch Forstner bit, I pre-drilled a little countersunk hole. The reason I'm doing this is because eventually I'll come back and fill all those holes and screws with some solid maple plugs to kind of hide the fact that I'm literally just screwing this entire thing together. When it comes to shop furniture, I like to shy away from fancy joinery or anything like that because I just want to get it done and move on with my life. So I pre-drilled and screwed my side panels into my 1 1/4 inch thick pieces of plywood that I already hooked to the wall. Once I got my 2 side panels firmly screwed on, I slid in my top panel, held it in place with a clamp, and I screwed that in from either side. When you're using hard maple or any hardwood, you want to make sure to pre-drill a pilot hole so that you don't split out your wood when you send your screws in. After I got my top piece in place, I started using the exact same method to throw in some shelves. And it was a really pretty spectacle to behold, as you can see. But I got everything clamped in place firmly eventually. I used a square to make sure it was, nice and square, and I measured to make sure it was level. Little tap there, little tap here, and I screwed that one in place too. Next, I added my bottom shelf. Now this one has to be set at a very specific height because I'm going to be adding this caster to my hinged cabinet on the front to support that corner as it opens up. So I had to set this shelf at the exact height of the caster so when I build the front cabinet, everything will line up all matchy-matchy. So just using the caster itself as a little setup block, I spaced my shelf appropriately, I pre-drilled, and of course I sank in some more screws. Screws are your friend when it comes to shop furniture, and you don't want to wait for glue to dry. Once again, just making sure everything was nice and square, and then I threw in some more shelves in the middle until I had what was starting to look like a pretty nice little storage cabinet built right onto the wall. And I'm telling you, this thing was flippin' solid, like a rock, or anything else you can think of that would be a good description of something solid. Next, I took measurements off of my existing cabinet and I cut down a piece of plywood for my front cabinet. Now this plywood has to be cut down because this front cabinet, well, it's gonna be floating up a little bit off the ground. And then I cut all my other pieces down to the right size. They already had that nice groove down the middle that I pre-cut. And then in order to make things a little easier, I decided to assemble 2 of my pieces just to get my frame started before I started trying to fit my 3/4 inch piece of plywood in there. Again, just pre-drilling with that 3/8 inch Forstner bit and sending some screws in there. Just like that. Now I had 2 portions of a 4-sided box put together. Now I've installed a lot of floating panels in my life, in cabinet doors and cabinets and that sort of thing, but I have to admit this is the biggest and most awkward panel I have ever tried to float in between a few pieces of wood, and it was a pain. I immediately wished I would have made that groove just a hair bigger and made life a lot simpler, but I didn't. So after I got it seated on the bottom piece, I decided it was going to be a little easier if I flipped it over. That way I could use some clamps to force the plywood into that groove. So I slid it into a more open area and I got some clamps, and fortunately enough, it popped into place just as I intended. Once I had it seated in those 2 sides, I laid it down on the floor, thinking it would be a lot easier to work on it in this orientation. And then I slapped on my bottom piece. That was easy enough, just to pound into place with a hammer. Once I had that in place, I added my top piece, and this was not too bad. I just got it all lined up, whacked it, and then of course measured my diagonals to make sure that everything was square. Which it was, because my piece of plywood was perfectly square, so it kind of self-squared the entire cabinet together. Then all I needed to do was once again screw all my pieces together so that it was held firmly in place. As you can see, I pre-drilled that 3/8 inch hole, then I do a pilot hole with a little drill bit, and then I send in my screws. This ensures everything is locked together nice and tight, and I don't risk at all splitting out that hard maple. After hooking all my pieces together, I sent some more screws right through my side panels and into that plywood, just to make sure that everything was super rock solid, because this is going to be a mobile piece, or mobile piece, however you say it, and I wanted it to be nice and sturdy. Then I carried my front cabinet over so that it was a little closer to its final destination, and I'm telling you, it was not light, and we're not even done adding weight to this thing yet. I laid it down on the floor. I figured it would be easier to add shelves to it now than when I got it all hooked to the other cabinet. I wanted all these shelves to be spaced out the same distance, so I just cut 2 spacer blocks, and I started plopping shelves in there. Again, just using pre-drilled holes and screws. I mean, what more do you need to lock a mobile secret clamp storage cabinet together? I did 1 shelf, and then before long I had 2 shelves, and then 3 shelves. And that's all the shelves I wanted, because I did want to leave some room for actual clamps to hang above. Then with all my shelves in place, I needed to add a caster to my outside bottom edge for a little added support when I open this thing up. It is all going to be mounted securely with a giant piano hinge, which honestly would probably be enough support, but I just decided to add this caster for a backup, insurance policy. So I pre-drilled some holes and I bolted this thing on to make sure that it would not go anywhere as well. Caster installed. I wanted to hide the caster so it wasn't super obvious that this thing could open up if you wanted it to. So I just made this little front skirt apron piece and I just glued and clamped it in place. I figured this wasn't going to get a lot of force put against it, so I didn't need screws. Just glue would probably be more than enough to hold it, and hopefully that'll hide the fact that this thing can secretly open.
Hey, I'm not a cow. but this video is sponsored by Bliss. Now, if you don't know what that is, well, let me tell you, it's the coolest company. I'm all about repurposing and reusing things and not wasting anything, and so is Bliss. It started in Bali, and they still work with Balinese artisans to create these awesome pieces of art. Basically, they work with the Balinese agriculture industry, and they take what would be waste products, animal skulls, and they turn them into awesome art pieces that can live in your home. I got this one, which is just the plain skull, but there's a ton of hand-carved, really cool pieces of art that you can get on their website, and they're awesome statement pieces. I named this guy Frank, and he's gonna live in the shop and be our new shop assistant. So, if you wanna get yourself a sweet piece of skull art, go check out Bliss's website. Right now they're running a special where you can get $50 off anything on their website. And remember, no animals were harmed just for their skulls. They work directly with the Balinese agriculture industry, and they're taking byproducts that would be thrown away, and they're making sweet art out of it. So check out that link in the video description and pick something cool out for your shop or your house or the grill of your truck. I mean, there's so many ways to use these sweet skulls. What do you think, Frank? Should they check it out? Frank thinks you should check it out.
While I waited for the glue to dry on my cabinet, I decided to start cutting some plugs so that I could hide all those screw holes that I put in the side of my cabinet. So I got a 3/8 inch plug cutter and a piece of scrap hard maple, and I started plugging away until I had a lot of plugs cut. After drilling them out with a plug cutter, I just ran it quickly through the bandsaw. This is a super satisfying thing to do, watching all those little plugs pop out. And before long, I had a lot of plugs. Now, before I plugged the sides, I decided to get my front cabinet installed with the hinge so that everything was hooked together into one unit. But because I'm working by myself, I needed to figure out a way that I could clamp the two pieces together and hold them in place while I got that hinge attached. So I screwed on these scrap pieces of plywood on the top of my cabinet, and then very carefully I lifted up my outer cabinet, making sure not to drop it. The caster on the outside actually made it a little easier to move this thing around, because if I lifted it a little bit, I could kind of wheel it into place. So that was fun and awkward, and I was terrified the entire time that I was going to lose my grip and it was going to come tumbling down on me or onto the floor, breaking into a zillion pieces. But fortunately enough, that didn't happen, and I was able to kind of wiggle it into the correct location. I slid it as close to the cabinet as I could. Now you notice it's lifted up on the left side on that caster, so I needed to put something on the right side so that I could, I thought it moved for a second, so that I could get it nice and level and get that piano hinge installed. So I just milled down a piece of scrap maple to the correct thickness and lifted it up and slid it under there until everything was level and exactly where it needed to be. And then because I installed those scrap pieces of ply on the top, I could just add some clamps to those to make sure that it wasn't going to move around on me while I got my hinge in place. And then of course I can just take those scrap pieces off when I'm done, and there will be a few holes in the top of my cabinet, but if you're getting on a ladder and looking at the top of my cabinet, you're not allowed in my shop. Next, it was time to install my piano hinge. Now, I could have installed this so that it was hooked to the inside of the cabinet so you wouldn't see as much of the hinge, but I thought that would have been much harder to get everything lined up. So because you're not really going to ever see this side of the cabinet, I just slapped it on the outside. That was the easiest way to install it and make sure everything was perfectly aligned. I also couldn't find a piano hinge long enough in this short a time period because all they had at Home Depot was 48-inch hinges. So I just used 2, but it'll work just as good. So once my piano hinges were installed, I removed those scrap pieces of ply, and if all goes according to plan, once I remove that bottom spacer block, this thing should swing open with the greatest of ease, just like a flying trapeze. And what do you know? Almost zero effort is required to pull this thing open. It sounds great, it moves great, and it works exactly as I hoped. In fact, it worked almost too good and wanted to swing open a little bit. So I decided to install a little stainless steel hinge that I had left over from the bar cart I built last week on the side, and that would keep it latched securely shut when I'm not accessing all the goodies inside. And what do you know? We are well on our way to a pretty sweet clamp storage organizational cabinet. Next, I wanted to cover up all these ugly holes with these beauties, these pre-cut maple plugs. I don't use plugs a lot, mainly because I don't use screws a lot when building things, but darn if it's not satisfying to hammer in a tight-fitting plug and hide a screw. I mean, I might start building things this way just for this one step. It reminds me of when I was a little kid and you hammer those pegs through that block, and then you flip it over and hammer the pegs back through, and then you flip it over and hammer them through again. You get the picture. I could do that for hours. After getting them all glued in place, I just use this little Japanese pole saw to flush cut my plugs. And then after I got them all flush cut, of course, I'll come back with a sander and make them look even prettier. But if installing plugs wasn't satisfying enough, flush cutting them after the fact is equally as satisfying. You should try it sometime. It's a heck of a lot of fun. My son loves doing this too. Sometimes I'll just put a bunch of plugs in a random piece of wood and have him flush cut them. He thinks it's a blast. After getting them all flush cut, I pulled out the sander and a sandy, and they were all smooth, and you could hardly even tell that I used a zillion screws to hook this thing together. I tested to make sure my door still opened far enough, and sure enough it does. That's good. That was also pure luck. I didn't even think about that when I was building and designing this. And everything opens and closes as it needs to. We are almost ready to start filling this thing up with clamps and goodies, but not quite yet. There's just a few other things we have to do first. Because this outside cabinet is going to move, I didn't want stuff falling off the shelf, so I decided to make a few maple rails to hold any contents on those shelves securely in place, so that I wasn't constantly picking things up that fell off when I opened the door. Of course, I screwed these on. Why not? I mean, I'm screwing everything else. And I covered the screws up with more plugs. Yay. Then I flush cut those plugs because I'm addicted to flush cutting. And once I got them all flush cut, I sanded everything smooth on the front. And there was just one more thing I needed to do. Paint the entire inside panel green. You might be asking, why? Why do you want the inside green? Well, it's so I can do cool stuff like this. Ooh. That's right. I figured I might as well use the inside of this cabinet as a green screen. I've actually been wanting one for a while. I think it'll be a lot of fun to have and add a little flair to videos. So because I didn't want to paint it, I pawned that job off on Craig. And because Craig didn't want to paint it, he pawned that job off on his son. And apparently because his son didn't want to paint it himself either, he pawned that job off on his younger brother. We got a real Tom Sawyer thing going on here. Anyways, it all got painted in the end, so I don't really care who did it. With the inside painted, it was finally time to start hanging clamps. Now this is the way that I like to hang clamps, with these guys. Now these aren't 4 clamps, they're actually 6-inch shelf brackets that I bought on Amazon. But they're really cheap, cheaper than most clamp hangers. And they work perfect for hanging up clamps because they got that little lip on the front so they can't slide off. You can put them anywhere you want. So I started screwing my shelf brackets in place and sliding on my clamps. And yes, of course, I will put a link in the video description for these brackets. I think you can get a pack of 6 for, I don't remember how much, but it's cheaper than clamp holders and they work great. If I would move out of the way so you can see. See? Look at all those beautiful clamps in there. Clamps galore. I might actually need to order just a few more. I'm not sure I got enough. Another thing I like to use to hang up clamps is just a piece of angle iron bolted onto any surface, because all you really need is a lip and you can just slide the clamps on and you can line up a ton of clamps on just a little piece of angle iron. So I used angle iron to fill in all the voids and, of course, add more clamp storage. Then below all the clamps, I figured this would be a great place to store my glue, because, you know, glue and clamps, they kind of go hand in hand when you're building anything. So I got a ton of glue and I loaded this thing up. My goal was to basically have my own little glue store so that I wouldn't have to run to Home Depot all the time. So I got a little bit of everything, and I think I'm pretty well stocked for any project that might come up. But you know I forgot something, and I'll be at Home Depot probably tomorrow morning. After getting everything organized on the inside, it was time to organize everything on the outside. The problem was, if you remember, I only have a 3/4 inch thick panel inset in that outside door, and that wasn't quite thick enough to screw a bunch of shelf brackets to. So I decided to beef up that outside layer a little bit more, and I added another 1/2 inch sheet of plywood just on that upper part where I'm going to be hanging all the clamps. Ivor rollerbladed around while I did this. He was a ton of help, just as a shop foreman should be. And then I set to work installing more shelf brackets, clamp holders on the front, and filling it up with more and more and more clamps. I'm going to find a project where I use every single one of these. I promise you. It's gonna happen. When you think about it, I just did find a project where I used every single one of these. I built a clamp storage rack, which in essence used every single clamp. So there you go. I also added another piece of angle iron to fill up that void and put some more clamps on. And then because I still had a few clamps left that wouldn't fit inside the cabinet, I installed some angle to the left and to the right of my newly built cabinet, and I slapped some more clamps on there. Because this is a clamp wall, so why not just go for it? The shop foreman's going for it. Boy, is he going for it. Apparently this is what he does behind my back when I'm not looking. I really don't know what to say about that. The boy likes to dance. See? Case in point. There's not even any music playing right now. He's just doing his own thing and loving it. Once I got all of my clamps finally installed, both in the cabinet and on the wall, there was just one thing left to do, and that was fill up these bottom shelves. One of the biggest things cluttering up my shop right now is just random bottles of whiskey laying pretty much on every surface. It's a little embarrassing, and it's hard to find the right bottle when you want it. So I figured it would be nice to have all of my bottles organized in one place. And this is just my shop whiskey collection. I've got twice this much in my house. But you can never have too much whiskey. Just like you can never have too many clamps.
Hey, pretty sweet, right? You got all your clamp storage up here, of course, your whiskey storage down here. And then the cool part, you got all that secret clamp storage right back here with your glue. I always like to hide my glue in a secret place because I don't want anyone to find it. So I put the whiskey in front and then hide the glue in the back. I'm a thinker.
Whoa,
Hey,
that is really cool. I like that.
Whoa, you got all your clamps, got stuff
nice.
in there. Trying to
I like
do my outro here. Interrupting a little.
Just
bit.
leave it.
Could you just
Get out of here.
All right. And of course, we got our green screen back here, which will be fun for future videos. If you haven't done so already, click the link in the video description to our Patreon account. If you're not signed up for Patreon, you are missing out on a ton of behind the scenes footage. We got a live weekly question and answer. And right now we're doing a contest where you could win a chance for me to come out to your place and build a project with you. So you don't want to miss out on that. There's also a link to our website, a bunch of new merch, and of course, all the tools and supplies we used in this video. So definitely go check that out.
Really cool.
I said, leave me alone. All right. Have a nice day. Don't forget to subscribe.